Continue with our Gemara. We are in Sanhedrin, Kuf Yud Beis, Amud Aleph, 112a. We're about the center of the page, the beginning of the line, where the word is Hachrem Oisav Eskola Shabbat Chulu, and then there's a colon. The Gemara, it begins with quoting the verse that's about to analyze, and that's the verse I just read. The verse states that we have to lay waste to the city and to all that is in it. The Gemara is now going to go through the details of what exactly has to be laid to waste of this Ir HaNidachas, of the city, the castaway city, the city that has been subverted and redirected to idol worship, and they had a special law, as we've been describing in the last couple of shiurim. And one of the unique laws of the city that worships idols versus an individual is that an individual who worships idols, his property gets inherited, whereas property of those who lived in the city that has been deemed an Ir HaNidachas, a castaway city in which the majority of the city, with all the other conditions described over the last few days, are met, then the property of the city gets burnt, gets laid to waste. Hachirim. So let's get into the details of this. Tan Rabbanan, our sages taught us. As always, the Gemara opens up very often with the Mishnah H text that elaborates on that which the Mishnah discussed. So Hachirim Oisa, the verse states, lay waste to it. There's Kol HaShabbat, everything that's in it. Now, what the Gemara is about to do is, the Gemara is what's deriving what's known as Klal Uprat, which means like this: when the Torah tells you a law, but the language the Torah uses is generalistic, then it means it's coming to include something that isn't necessarily explicitly stated. And then, when the Torah uses language that is particular, restrictive, then it's coming to restrict and exclude something that you might have thought is still included. And that's what the Gemara is about to do, going through this verse, where there's inclusive terms and exclusive terms, generalistic terms and specific terms, thus including certain details or excluding other details. So let's see. First, Hachrem Oisa, lay waste to it. It is in the singular, it's a restrictive language, it's a particular language, and therefore, Prat L'Nichsas Hadikim. This comes to exclude property that belongs to the righteous, Shebachutzala, that's outside of the city. But, Veskol HaShabbat, the verse continues and reads, lay waste to it. It is a particular language, and therefore comes to exclude property of the righteous that's outside of the city. A righteous person who lives in the city that was deemed an Ir HaNidachas, and he owns property in a nearby town, then that stuff is left alone, because the verse excludes something. So it excludes property of the righteous that are in a different city. But then the verse is expansive. The verse is inclusive. The verse uses a general term, Ve'es Kol HaShabbat, and everything that's in it. Rabbi, so this comes to include something. This comes to include Nichsas Hadikim Shebesoicha, property of the righteous that are in the city. So that property does get destroyed because there is an inclusive term to include something of the righteous. In other words, we have one restrictive term and one inclusive term. So the restrictive term tells us that certain property of the righteous did not get burnt, not get destroyed with the rest of the city, namely property of the righteous that's outside of the city. But then there's an inclusive term, which implies that some of the righteous property gets destroyed, and that is the property that belongs to the righteous that's still in that city. Then the verse reads, Shalala, it's loot. That's called Shalala, and all of its loot, all of its property. It's another word for property. All of its loot, it's usually what's used. Says that's a restrictive term. Shalala, it's shalal, it's loot, it's property, but loy shalal shamayim, and not property that belongs to heaven. And we'll discuss the details of that later. Various different degrees of if someone in that city made a donation to the temple, on whatever degree, we'll discuss the details of that later. But the bottom line is, those property is not shalala. It's not the property of the city. It's the property of heaven, and therefore it does not get destroyed. It's excluded by that restrictive term shalala. It's property and not property that belongs to heaven. But then the verse says the es kol shlala. But when the verse introduces that restrictive term shlala, its property, it says kol shlala, all of its property. The word all is inclusive. It's a general term, and therefore must come to include something. L'rabis, this comes to include nichsei rishayim shebechutzala. It comes to include property of the wicked that is outside of the city. So in other words, like this, the sum total is that everything that's in the city has to be destroyed, with the exception of anything in the city that belongs to the temple. Now, with respect to property that belongs to members of the city that's not in the city, so if it's property of the righteous, protected, not destroyed. If it's property of the wicked, even though it's not in the city, it is still destroyed with this city. Rabbi Shimon says, why is it that the Torah tells us, why is it that the law is that property of the righteous that's in the city should get destroyed? In other words, if he's righteous, why should he lose any of his property? We said before that the righteous lose their property that's in the city. The property that's outside of the city gets saved, doesn't get destroyed along with the rest of the city. Now, if he's righteous, why should he lose any of his property? So explains Rabbi Shimon, why is it that these righteous people are living among such heathens and such terrible people who are worshipping idols? Must be mamoinam, their lust for money. They felt that there was good business opportunities, so they went there even though they knew it was a bad city. Therefore, because mamoinam, therefore their property, their money is destroyed because the money is what brought them into the city to begin with. Okay, so this is the end of the Mishnah Gauge text. Now there's an interesting Rashi I want to highlight. Rashi's comments on the word, Rashi comments on the words which say, Rabbi Shimon says, why is it that the Torah says that the property, the tzaddik that's in the city should get destroyed? Says Rashi, B'chol duchta, in all occasions, Rabbi Shimon decides, Talmud to explain the verse, to give the reason for the verse. What's Rashi saying? I mean, it seems obvious. Rabbi Shimon's giving a reason. So it's interesting because there are different attitudes in learning Gemara, in learning Torah. One could say, and this is the predominant way of thinking, is Torah says, so that's the reason. In other words, why is it that the righteous property that's in the city gets destroyed? Well, because the Torah said so. Who cares? So Rashi comes and says, no, Rabbi Shimon had this pattern of trying to rationalize the words of the Torah. Not, God forbid, to say that if the rationale doesn't fit, he's going to discard the words of the Torah. God forbid. The words of the Torah are true in and of themselves. But Rabbi Shimon's custom was that whenever he could, he would apply rationale to the Torah law. And this is similar to the Rambam's view, without getting into the details of where it says it and what the context is. But the generalistic view is, Rambam's of the view, as he states explicitly on a number of occasions, that when Torah says something, that's the end of it. God said, and that's the reason. But nonetheless, because Hashem wants to have a relationship with us that isn't just submissive, but rather is understanding and appreciative, so God says, try your best to understand. And if you can't understand, then accept it because I said so. But to the best of your ability, try to explain. And that's perhaps what Rashi is telling us with Rabbi Shimon's view, that even though the Torah says that the property of the righteous that's in the city should get destroyed, and if there's no reason to explain it, Torah says that's the end of it. But nonetheless, Rabbi Shimon had this pattern of always trying to explain the reasons for the verse, even though if he lacked a reason, he would still accept it because this is what God wants. Okay. So that was the Mishnah Gauge text. Now the Gemara comes to analyze this Mishnah Gauge text. Amar Mar. Literally, Amar Mar means master said. It means, we stated before in the name of a reverent individual. Namely, that is called Shlala Tikvaitz. All of the property, all of its property has to be destroyed. This term, all, which is an inclusive term, comes to include that even the property of the wicked that's not in the city, but it's in a different city, because it belongs to the wicked, it's got to be dragged into the city to be destroyed with it. And therefore, so this is the Gemara now adds, Amar Rav Chisda states, Rav Chisda is a sage from the Gemara, so he's a couple hundred years later commenting on the text earlier from the Mishnah Gauge. Rav Chisda says, because the verse says, when the verse says that inclusive term, that all of its property gets to be destroyed, and we said all of its property, the word all, this inclusive term, comes to tell you that the property of the wicked that's not in the city also has to be destroyed. But that inclusive term is followed by the word tikbot, shall be ingathered. And therefore, says Rav Chisda, therefore, these property of the wicked that's outside of the city that has to be destroyed with the rest of the city is only such property that can easily be transferred into the city within a day. But if it's so far, if it's in Australia, and it would take months or weeks or whatever to get that property here, then it's not considered nikbatzim, it's not considered easily incorporated within the city, and therefore does not fall under that inclusive term that the property of the wicked would be destroyed. The sum total, therefore, is the property of the righteous, only if it's in the city, gets destroyed. The property of the wicked, if it's in the city, certainly gets destroyed. If it's out of the city, it gets destroyed, but only if it could make it here within a day. If it takes too much travel, too much effort to bring it to the city, it's left alone, and as the city is destroyed, that property does not get destroyed. Amar Rav Chisda states another law with respect to property belonging to an Ir HaNidachas, property belonging to this castaway city, and whether or not it gets destroyed. Pikdonos. A pikadon is like a property that I leave in the hand in somebody else. It's not collateral. It's called the words escapes me. I have something and I ask someone to hold it for me. So the person's holding onto my property, just protecting it. So, Ir HaNidachas, these things called the pikadon of a city of Ir HaNidachas, return is permissible. It's not to be destroyed. This is Rav Chisda's statement. Now the Gemara, which comes a little after Rav Chisda, is now going to analyze what did Rav Chisda mean. What was he telling us? Hey Chidomi, what are the circumstances of this pikadon, of this property that's being held in the hands of somebody else, and its relation? What's its specific relationship to the Ir HaNidachas? Who owns it and who's holding on to it? Because Rav Chisda doesn't say so. Rav Chisda just says the pikadon related to the Ir HaNidachas, or the pikadon of the Ir HaNidachas. But who's holding it and where does it come from? So the Gemara asks, hey Chidomi, what are the circumstances? If you're going to suggest that this pikadon, this object, this piece of property, not a piece of land, but this property, this item, belongs to someone from a different city, and it's being held as a pikadon, as an object, in the home of someone who lives in Ir HaNidachas, obviously it's permissible. It's not the property of that city. It belongs to somebody in another city. So just because it happens to be held in the house of someone who lives in the city, therefore should get destroyed, it doesn't belong to that person. It belongs to somebody in a neighboring town. Therefore, rather, when Rav Chisda says, when Rav Chisda comes to teach us a novel law that a pikadon related to an Ir HaNidachas is permissible, he's not coming to tell us that a pikadon that belongs, or an object that belongs to somebody from a different city being held in Ir HaNidachas is permissible, because that's obvious. Rav Chisda wouldn't need to tell us that. Rav Chisda is only telling us something if it's novel. Just parentheses. Why do I have to assume Rav Chisda is saying something novel? Why can't he be saying something obvious? So I've explained this a number of times, but it's worth reiterating. Whenever we have a statement from our sages, it's not as if they just said this at random. You have to remember that at the time, there was no printing press, and people weren't even writing down what they learned. Everything they learned had to be committed to memory. So what would happen is a teacher would give a class for an hour or two, and at the end of the class, he would tell the students, okay, memorize this line. Commit these words to memory. And then the student would be able to use that phrase to trigger the memory of the entire class. So if Rav Chisda if we have a statement from Rav Chisda, that means Rav Chisda told the students, commit these words to memory. And Rav Chisda wouldn't be telling the students to commit something to memory if it's obvious. And therefore, it's so obvious that property that belongs to someone from a different city, that's being held by somebody in this city, should not be destroyed because it doesn't belong to anybody in this city. It's so obvious that Rav Chisda would not be telling the students, remember this. It's obvious. They would know it on their own. They don't need Rav Chisda to tell them to memorize this law. And therefore, therefore must be, Ella rather, Tidayu, it belongs to someone in that city. And now it belongs to somebody, and now it's being held by somebody in the other city. Okay. Now, what are the circumstances of that? How far is that other city where this pikadon is being held from the Ir HaNidachas? If it can be gathered within one day, why is it permissible? We just said before that property that belongs to the wicked, that's outside of the city of Ir HaNidachas, if it can be gathered in within a day, it gets destroyed. So just because it happens to be pikadon, why should it be permissible? It's the property of the wicked. It's being held in the home of somebody nearby, and if it's an hour drive away, bring it to the town, get it destroyed. But if it's so far that it can't be brought into the city, then you already told us that it's permissible, just by the very fact that we said the law earlier. Rav Chisda himself said the law earlier, that if property is within a radius of one day travel, it gets brought to the city to destroy. If it's outside that radius, then it doesn't get destroyed. And therefore, it would be redundant to tell us to commit to memory the same law with respect to a pikadon. So what are the circumstances in which Rav Chisda is telling us a unique din that a pikadon, this item that's being held in the hands of somebody within an Ir HaNidachas, given to him by someone from outside the Ir HaNidachas, that's permissible? What's the unique novel case under which I would have thought maybe it has to be destroyed? And Rav Chisda is saying, no, it's permissible to keep, you don't have to destroy it. Never says the Gemara al-Olam. Really, the circumstances are as follows: the Ir HaNidachas, this item, this pikadon came from someone in a different city. The mafkidi b'soicha, and it's being held in the home of someone who lives in the city. And this b'mayas, what's this unique circumstance? The person in the Ir HaNidachas took responsibility for it, which means like this: if I ask you to hold something for me, now, depending on the circumstances of our agreement, you are liable only up to a certain degree. So if you, for example, took responsibility that should this item be broken or stolen or lost, you have to repay me, then to some degree you have ownership over it, because you are being held accountable to it. And there says Rav Chisda like this: you might have thought, if I gave an item to somebody who lives in Ir HaNidachas, and I said, please hold this for me, and he took responsibility for that object, and therefore he owns some of it in some sense, because if we're stolen, he would have to pay me back. Then you might have thought, well, hey, if the person in the Ir HaNidachas owns it to the point that he would have to repay me because he took responsibility, maybe it belongs to him enough to the point that it has to be destroyed with the city. And therefore Chisda says, no, don't think so. Don't make that mistake. Rather, because it in essence belongs to me and I live outside of the Ir HaNidachas, it does not get destroyed. As the Gemara says. What are the circumstances? For example, the Kabbalah is the person who lives in the city of the Ir HaNidachas, who's holding this object, took responsibility for the object. I might have thought, is because this person living in the Ir HaNidachas accepted responsibility for that object, to some degree, it's as if he owns it. Therefore, we are taught, no, even though he took responsibility and to some degree does belong to it, it doesn't belong to him enough to the point that if the city becomes Ir HaNidachas, it gets destroyed with it. Rather, it goes back to the original owner, and the property, that item does not have to be destroyed. Another law from Rav Chisda with respect to property of an Ir HaNidachas. Beheman animal, Chetze shel Ir HaNidachas, which is owned in partnership. Half of it belongs to someone who lives in this Ir HaNidachas, in this castaway city. V'chetzi, and half of it shel Ir HaCheres belongs to somebody in a different city. Asura, it's forbidden. That item it cannot be enjoyed because half of it, 50% of it, belongs to someone who's from an Ir HaNidachas, and therefore that guy's property has to be destroyed. But Isa, dough, dough, which is owned 50-50, half by someone who lives in this Ir HaNidachas, in this castaway city, and half belongs to someone in a different city, muteris is permissible. What's the difference between dough and an animal? An animal which is owned 50-50, 50 by someone in the Ir HaNidachas and 50 outside the Ir HaNidachas, forbidden, destroyed with the rest of the city. But dough is not, it's permissible. And even though it belongs 50-50, the same way the animal does. So my time, what's the reason? Says the Gemara, Behema, commando loy palgadama. An animal can't be cut in half. And because it can't be cut in half, the entirety of the animal becomes forbidden. Now, even if you were to kill it first and then split it in half, the moment you've killed it, you've already done that which Torah requires to be done to the animal. Torah says that the animal of Ir HaNidachas has to be killed. So the moment you kill it, it's been killed as property of an Ir HaNidachas. Now, if that's the case, there is no part of it that can be permissible, because you can't split it before the moment of death. But dough, Isa, commanda pagadama, dough could be split in half. And because it could be split in half, therefore it's permissible. There's no reason to destroy the whole thing. Okay. Boy, Rav Chisda asked the following question. I mentioned this before, that when Gemara introduces a question with the word boy, it means an inquiry. So Rav Chisda doesn't have an agenda or have an opinion. He's asking because he wants to know. So boy, Rav Chisda raised the following inquiry. Behemoth Ir HaNidachas, a animal that belongs to a castaway city, not 50-50. It just belongs to someone who lives in the Ir HaNidachas, which means this animal has to be put to death, has to be destroyed like everything else in the city. Mahu, what's the law? When if I slaughter this animal, does it render this thing not an avela? So just explain what this is. The law is that if the carcass of an animal is killed in a non-kosher way, then that animal contracts or confers a certain level of impurity. Now, this animal that belongs to Ir HaNidachas is supposed to be killed by Torah law, because it belongs to a city of an Ir HaNidachas, and all the property there's got to get destroyed. Now, what if I give it a kosher shechita? So I fulfilled the Torah's requirement to kill it, but I did it in such a way that ordinarily it would mean the carcass, it doesn't confer impurity. So does that specific law, that shechita, that ritual slaughtering, proper slaughtering, removes the carcass from being able to confer impurity, does that happen if I were to ritually slaughter an animal that's supposed to die because it's part of an Ir HaNidachas? I certainly can't eat it because it belongs to an Ir HaNidachas, and one's not allowed to derive any benefit from property that belongs to Ir HaNidachas. But the question is, if the shechita, if the slaughtering is enough to prevent it from conferring impurity, as it would ordinarily. So let's see the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, I might say, Leficha Rav Amar Rachman of the Torah said that the animal has to be put to death by a sword. Loishna shchita mishchat, loishna katel miklat. Doesn't matter if you slaughter it ritually. It doesn't matter if you kill it by beheading it, wherever you kill it. The point is, the Torah says to kill it, so you killed it. And since you've killed it in the manner that it's supposed to be killed. Because you've killed it in the manner that it's supposed to be killed as part of the Ir HaNidachas, therefore, it's considered a carcass that does confer impurity, because you killed it not for the sake of shchita. You didn't kill it for the sake of ritual slaughtering, because you can't eat it. You ate it. You killed it for the sake of it being part of the Ir HaNidachas, even though it happens to be slaughtering, because Torah doesn't care how you kill the animals of Ir HaNidachas, as long as you killed it. Or on the other side of the coin, given the shachta, because the reality is the manner in which you killed it is a slaughtering, which is not beheading or some other way of killing it, but you actually did the ritual slaughtering. That the reality is you did it that way. You did it through ritual slaughtering, and therefore it would remove this carcass from rendering anything impure. Two sides to the coin. Do I say it's dead? It doesn't matter how it dies, because it died as part of Ir HaNidachas, it does confer impurity, or no, because I killed it in a certain way that renders it something that does not transfer impurity. It retains that aspect and doesn't transfer impurity, even though I can't eat it because I'm not allowed to enjoy anything of Ir HaNidachas. It says Gemara Teku, unresolved question, no answer. Okay, one more inquiry from the Gemara. Boy Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef inquires. Again, this word boy, which means an inquiry, which means Rav Yosef doesn't have an agenda, doesn't have an opinion. He's just asking because he wants to know. So Rav Yosef inquires. Seir Nashim Tzidkanius, hair that belongs to righteous women who lived in the Ir HaNidachas, but they did not worship idols. What happens to their hair? What's the law with their hair? Does it get destroyed with the rest of the property? Or is it considered an extension of their body and it doesn't have to be destroyed? Does not have to be destroyed. Amar Rava, now, before we get to answering the question, Rava first analyzes the inquiry to begin with. Amar Rava asks, Hadir Aser? Are you saying hair that belongs to wicked people, that to you is obvious, that is forbidden to enjoy? Right? You're asking whether or not the hair of the righteous women have to be destroyed also. What about the hair of the wicked? You're so certain that cannot be enjoyed, that it has to be destroyed? The Torah says, Tik bits v'sarafta, you should gather all the property and burn it. Ksiv, that's what the verse states. Which means all you need to do is collect it, gather it, and burn it. But yotza zeh, that would exclude something. That would exclude something that requires not just gathering and burning, but cutting, gathering, and burning, which would be the hair of the wicked. In other words, Rava is saying even the hair of the wicked is allowed to be enjoyed. You can make you can turn it into a sheitel, something like that, I guess. Because the Torah says, gather all the property and burn it. Now this hair can't be just gathered and burnt. It has to be shorn, gathered, and then burnt. And therefore, Rava is arguing, even the hair of the wicked is not so obvious, it's not so clear that it's forbidden. Perhaps it's actually permissible. And therefore, Rava says, no, here's really the question that Rabbi Yosef is asking. The Peah Nachas is talking about a sheitel, a wig. Now, what kind of wig? If it's the kind of wig which is stitched into one's hair, I guess this is the kind of thing where they would maybe put extensions in the hair, where they would take fake hair and attach it to their head, I suppose. Now, if that's the case, kugufidame, it's like part of our body. And the same way you don't burn the clothing that the righteous are wearing, you don't burn the hair that's attached to her body. So rather tzicho, here's the question. The toli besifta. This sheitel is hanging on a sheitel head. The wig is standing on a wig head. It's standing on like a pole or some sort of hook. So do I consider this hair, this sheitel, property, like any other property of the righteous, which the law is, if the property of the righteous is in the city, it's got to be burnt. Or perhaps given the isle of because the woman's constantly taking it on and off, putting it on and off, it's considered like her clothing. So what's the law of the sheitel? Sheitel that belongs to a righteous woman who lives in the castaway city. If it's like regular property, then it gets destroyed, because all property of the righteous, if it's in the city, gets destroyed. Or is it considered like her clothing because she's constantly putting it on and off, and therefore she's allowed to walk out with wearing it, just like she's allowed to walk out wearing her clothing, and it doesn't get destroyed. And therefore the Gemara says, take with this question remains unresolved. Okay, 2 more lines so we can finish the page. The Gemara says, the law is that all of its property has to be gathered into the town square, or the thoroughfare. That's what the verse says. So Tanur Rabbanan and our sages taught in analyzing this text, if it doesn't have a thoroughfare, the city, which has been deemed an Ir HaNidachas, and the whole city has to get destroyed, and the property has to be gathered to the thoroughfare, as the Torah says, what if it doesn't have a thoroughfare? So because the Torah says it has to have a thoroughfare in which you gather all the property, and this city does not have a thoroughfare, it just doesn't get the law of Ir HaNidachas. And I guess each individual person who worships idols is judged as an individual who worships idols rather than as a collective city. Divid Rabbi Shmuel, this is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva says, and Rabbi Kiva is the opinion we quoted earlier in the Mishnah, Ein lo rachav, if the city does not have a thoroughfare or a square, oisin lo rachav, you make a thoroughfare. You make a thoroughfare, and then you gather its property and you burn it there. Because the Torah says you have to burn it in the thoroughfare. So Rabbi Shmuel says if it doesn't have a thoroughfare, that's a disqualifying factor. It can't be counted as Ir HaNidachas. It can't be counted can't qualify as a castaway city. Rabbi Kiva says it's just a condition for how you have to burn it. And therefore, if it doesn't have a thoroughfare, make one. The Gemara analyzes, but Micah Mifli, what's the root of their argument? Going back to the verse says you have to gather it into the rechayva, into its thoroughfare, into its square. What's their argument in terms of understanding the verse? Explain to the Gemara. Rabbi Shmuel is of the view that when the verse says rechayva, you have to gather it into its thoroughfare. It means its thoroughfare that it already had, and if it doesn't have one, it disqualifies it as Ir HaNidachas. It doesn't qualify. Rabbi Kiva is of the view rechayva, gathered to its thoroughfare, is not its thoroughfare that it already had, but to gather it to its thoroughfare hashta, the thoroughfare of now. Name mashma is also implied, and therefore, if you don't have a thoroughfare, make a thoroughfare. So these are many of the details of the Ir HaNidachas. And tomorrow, God willing, we get into what's the story or what happens to any property in the Ir HaNidachas that was donated to the temple, and what type of donation, and what should happen to those things. You certainly can't burn it because it doesn't belong to the people, it belongs to heaven. We already said before, the verse said, Shalala, you got to burn its property, V'lo shalosh shamayim, and not property that belongs to heaven. And because these items were already consecrated as donations to the temple, they can't be destroyed with Ir HaNidachas. So what do you do with it? And the Gemara is going to discuss, depending on the level of donation, whether it's meant to be a carbon, whether it's meant for just upkeep of the temple, or was it truma, meiser, all kinds of different levels of dedication to God, and therefore making it not property of the city. And we'll discuss what is to be done with all those items. That is coming up tomorrow, God willing. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the sun.